Today, I'm gonna check out the... wait, really? Are we really doing this? Yeah? Oh, okay. We're gonna check out the 6500 XT. I mean, it can't be that bad, can it? I can't go on. I need GPUs. But it's the apocalypse. There are no GPUs. No GPUs at all. We're doomed. Doomed. Wait, over there. Amongst that pile of literal worthless garbage. Could it be? Yes, it's a GPU. We're saved. Oh, wait, no. I was wrong. It's not a GPU. It's just another piece of worthless garbage shaped like a GPU. Oh, man. Kyle? Yes, Trevor? I love you, man. I feel the same way. I finally got one of these, you guys. It's been a long time coming. Everyone hates this GPU. Everyone. Nobody can see this thing as anything other than a piece of garbage. Now, I try to look on the bright side of the things I buy and test and review. I like almost everything, to be honest. Even crappy stuff, I can usually find something to like about it. I've heard so much hate directed at this GPU. It's basically a meme at this point. But is it really as bad as they say? Well, let's answer that today, shall we? I paid 270 Canadian looties for this. That's what we call dollars here in Canada. Looties, because our $1 coins have a loot on them. And that's equivalent to 215 USDs. This is the gigabyte version of the 6500 XT. Something about an eagle? I don't know. It's nothing special, but I don't dislike the way it looks. It's pretty cool looking. It's kind of minimalist with some nice aesthetic touches. It has this plastic shroud and two fans, kind of a neutral gray tone with some blue accents, no backplate, a pretty bare bones, but it's not ugly. It'll look alright in a build. The 6500 XT has 4 gigabytes of GDDR6 VRAM, 1024 CUDA cores, 2610 MHz core clock with a 2815 MHz boost clock. It has 16 compute units and 16 ray accelerators, if you can believe that. Yeah, this card can do ray tracing. Not very well, to be honest, but it can do it, sorta. I'm doing a separate video on ray tracing on this GPU, so I'm not going to mess around with that in this video. Get subscribed if you don't want to miss that. Around the back, we have only 2 display connections, 1 DisplayPort and 1 HDMI. Oh, the horror. Over here, we can actually see that only the first section of the PCIe connection are actually connected to the circuitry in the PCB. This is that 4 PCIe lanes issue that you've probably heard everybody screaming about. This is apparently a huge deal. The main criticisms of this GPU that I've seen are this. It's only 4 PCIe lanes, and therefore has different performance depending on if it's running on PCIe Gen 3 or PCIe Gen 4. It doesn't have hardware encoding, so recording gameplay or streaming may be a problem if you don't have a CPU that can handle that. And it only has 2 display connections, 1 DisplayPort and 1 HDMI. Oh, and it's also underpowered and it doesn't play games good, I guess. So we're gonna check out all this stuff and try to see the positive side of this thing. If it has enough redeeming qualities to recommend it in any capacity, or if it's really as bad as everyone says and we can just throw it right in the trash with the rest of the literal garbage. Let's start off with the gaming tests. We'll test a few games and see how it does. This is actually running in my little ITX PC that I built in a recent video. That's linked in the description below. This is running an i5-12400F in a B660 motherboard with 16 gigabytes of 3200 MHz RAM. The 6500 XT will be running at PCIe Gen 4 speeds for the gaming tests to give it the best chance that it can have to do okay. I'm not expecting to be blown away, but we'll see if we can at least use it to play games and have a good time. Let's start off, as always, with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, running at 1080p, high preset. We're gonna get 58 FPS average. That's great. You know, I'm happy with that. Obviously, you can go down to 900p to bump up the settings if you need to. This area of the game that I use for my benchmark runs is a very intensive area, so this is about as bad as it's gonna get. And it's running just fine. I'd be super happy to play through the game like this. In The Witcher 3, we're running at 1080p with maxed out ultra settings, everything cranked, and we still end up with 61 FPS. So this GPU can do some great 1080p gaming apparently, and probably some 1440p gaming too if you lowered the settings or made use of upscaling techniques like FSR or RSR. Yeah, RSR is AMD's new system-wide upscaling feature. Did you know this GPU has access to that with the latest drivers? So you can run any game at a lower resolution and upscale it to a higher resolution using RSR, which applies a filter and some sharpening to make it look like it's running at a higher resolution than it is. I'm going to be doing a separate video on upscaling, comparing DLSS to FSR to RSR, so get subscribed so you don't miss that. On to GTA 5, our standard candle game benchmark, running at 1080p with maxed out settings, except for the advanced settings like distance scaling. We're gonna get 93 FPS average. I love that this game runs so well on pretty much any hardware, but when you crank the settings right up, it can become pretty demanding on lower end cards. This 6700 XT is priced like a lower end card, but it's performing great considering the $215 price tag. Moving along to God of War. I initially chose to run it at the high preset, and I was playing for a good 10 minutes and getting 65 FPS on average, but then at some point I started getting into massive stutters.
Move.
Thanks.
And I noticed that my 4GB VRAM buffer was full. Yeah, you're not going to be able to run most modern games with ultra or even high textures with only 4GB of VRAM. So I bumped this down to the original preset, which is the medium settings in this game, and it ran fine after that. In Horizon Zero Dawn, I had the same issue. I couldn't run at the high preset without reaching that 4GB VRAM buffer. So I ran this one with the original preset, which is the medium settings, and it ran really well. It looks great too. I don't think you'll notice that much of a difference in most games from running with medium textures versus high or ultra. At 1080p with these settings, Horizon Zero Dawn got an average of 64 FPS. Not bad, right? What about Cyberpunk 2077, the most unoptimized game ever? I mean, it looks really good when you crank up the settings, but it does not perform well compared to how it looks, in my opinion. So to get anything close to playable at 1080p, we had to go down to the low preset, and we only got 47 FPS. Now this game does have built-in FSR, so we could use some upscaling to get that up to 60 plus FPS. Which is what I'd probably do if I were playing on this GPU, to be honest, but at least we could play at 1080p native, albeit with a low preset. Here's some CSGO, 1080p with maxed out settings. I can't be bothered to get the MSI Afterburner overlay working in this game. You gotta do a bunch of stuff and it's annoying, so I use Steam's built-in FPS counter. As far as I could tell, I got about 320 FPS, approximately. This is more of a CPU limited game, so you'll need a good CPU to get these FPS, but the 6500 XT definitely won't have any issue running these esports titles well, like CSGO or Valorant or Fortnite. I might do another video testing this GPU in esports titles. Is that something you want to see? Let me know in the comments below. Here's Far Cry 5, 1080p, ultra settings, and we get 68 FPS average. This is an AMD sponsored title, so you'd probably expect it to favor AMD cards. This game is always a wild card in my testing. Sometimes it runs really terribly, way worse than it should compared to the other games, depending on the hardware. Luckily for the 6500 XT, it's running great here. What about Doom? 1080p in the Vulkan engine, ultra settings, we get 122 FPS average. Yeah, baby, that's what I'm talking about. I mean, Doom isn't the most demanding game. Doom Eternal is more demanding, but I prefer the original. And I like to play this with very high FPS. And I'm really happy that the 6500 XT has no issue running at 100 plus FPS. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, 1080p, medium preset. We got 57 FPS average. It was running great, having lots of fun playing this on this GPU, but then we had that VRAM issue. We started getting some stutters when the VRAM utilization got close to 4 gigabytes. Not tons, but it was noticeable. This is one of those VRAM heavy games that gets bogged down by 4 gigabyte GPUs. I think in this case, I'd run with resolution scaling down to, I don't know, like 80% or 70%. That would take some of the pressure off the VRAM buffer without needing to go down to low textures. Other than that, it's running well in terms of FPS, and it looks great at these settings. Red Dead Redemption 2, 1080p with Vulkan rendering, and we're at the medium preset with that quality slider right in the middle, and we got 68 FPS average, which really surprised me because that preset had the textures at ultra. And we didn't have any VRAM issues in this game, so I think the 4 gigabyte VRAM will be totally fine in lots of games. And in some other games, you'll have to lower the settings or the resolution scale to avoid any issues. In the future, I think these 4 gigabyte VRAM GPUs will become dated the way that 2 gigabyte GPUs are today. But for the time being, you can at least play modern games with decent settings and have them looking mighty fine, as you can see.
He wants a woman!
Yes, there you go. Please don't leave me in here. Whew, thank God for that.
Stay calm now.
And finally, the most demanding game in our test suite, Microsoft Solitaire. I was running this at 1080p, full screen. There are no settings options here. I didn't know what to expect going into this test. This game has a 60 FPS cap, and somehow this 6500 XT was able to maintain a constant 60 FPS, even when the action heated up and I was moving lots of cards around on the screen. And not only was the performance great during gameplay, but I won the match. Yeah, baby. And during that mind-blowing victory animation at the end, with all the cards bouncing around, this GPU maintained a constant 60 FPS the entire time. Wow, just wow. This is what PC gaming is all about. Now, all of this gameplay was tested at PCIe Gen 4 speed, which has a bandwidth of 64 gigabytes per second. But how does it do with PCIe Gen 3, which only has 32 gigabytes per second? Well, from my tests in the past, running GPUs in PCIe Gen 4 versus 3 doesn't really impact the performance that much. However, most GPUs have at least 8 PCIe lanes. The 6500 XT, with its 4 PCIe lanes, bumping down to half the bandwidth by going to PCIe Gen 3 supposedly will cripple the performance. But how bad is it really? Well, I tested 3 games. In God of War, running at PCIe Gen 4 speed, our little intro benchmark, I got an average of 65 FPS, which is consistent with how well the game ran during my gameplay test. Surely, going down to PCIe Gen 3 is going to be a horror show, right? Well, let's try that. Did this make any difference? Well, in the same benchmark, with the 6500 XT running on PCIe Gen 3, we get an average of 64 FPS. We lost an FPS. Oh my gosh, this thing is total garbage, is the reaction you'd expect based on the discussion online. But one game isn't enough to draw conclusions, so let's do another. Here's The Witcher 3. On PCIe Gen 4, our little benchmark walk gave us 57 FPS. And how did it do when we went down to Gen 3? 55 FPS. So, it's a little lower, I guess, but not much at all. And Far Cry 5, running on PCIe Gen 4, the built-in game benchmark gave us an average of 77 FPS. But then when we switched over to PCIe Gen 3, we got an average of 74 FPS. So it's a little lower, but it's only 4% different. But here's the thing, this isn't a 6500 XT problem. Every GPU gets slightly reduced performance when comparing Gen 4 to Gen 3. Let's try this same Far Cry 5 benchmark with my 3060. That's a much more powerful card, so on PCIe Gen 4, it gets 121 FPS on average, but when we switch to PCIe Gen 3, it goes down to 117. That's 3% different, almost the same as the 6500 XT. So how big a deal is this whole 4 lanes PCIe Gen 3 fiasco? Well, in my opinion, this is totally overblown. Some games might suffer more than the tests I've done, but those same games will suffer with any GPU going from Gen 4 to Gen 3. For the 6500 XT, it really doesn't make much of a difference. Not any more than you'd expect from any GPU. So I say that this is not a big deal. Now, other criticisms of this card are that it only has 2 display outs. And yeah, that's valid. Even cheap GPUs like the T400 have at least 3 display ports. But how big a deal is this? Well, it'll depend on your setup, I guess. I run a 4 monitor setup, so I probably couldn't get by with this card. But I think lots of people run a dual monitor setup, so they'd be just fine. And many people run with just one single monitor. So, I mean, at least you know what you're getting into. And if your CPU has integrated graphics, you can use the display out on your motherboard for a 3rd or 4th display. And you can always add a 3rd display with one of those USB display dongles. You're not gonna get good gaming performance from any of those secondary display methods, so don't try to use those for your primary gaming display. But at least you can get more than 2 displays working if you have a 6500 XT, if you really need to. I say this is not a big deal, in my opinion. Now, what about the encoding? If you didn't know, this GPU does not come with hardware encoding. That means you can't use the GPU to encode your gameplay for streaming or recording like you can with most GPUs. Is this a big problem? Well, it depends. Does your CPU have enough juice to handle encoding on its own? Well, my 12400F had no problem. In fact, all of the gameplay that you saw in the game benchmarks was recorded on the PC that I was using to test, using CPU encoding while I was playing. It didn't cause a single issue. And I think most modern-ish CPUs will allow you to use software encoding without issue. However, if you have an older CPU, like a quad-core CPU like an old i5, then you probably will have problems using software encoding. Here's a gameplay from one of my machines running with an i5 4690 and 16 gigabytes of DDR3 RAM, recording in OBS using the low CPU usage software encoding option. And, well, it seems like it works at first, but then eventually we start getting stutters. If you keep an eye on the statistics, you'll notice that the stutters happen once the CPU usage reaches 100%. So it really depends on your CPU if the encoding thing is a problem. Yes, it would have been nice if they included hardware encoding, but if it let them keep costs down, then fine. No hardware encoding. Just know that going in, and if you don't need that stuff, then you'll be fine with this GPU. And if you do need encoding, just get a different GPU. It's as simple as that. So is this a big deal? Well, maybe, sorta. Yeah, I guess. And now we come to the heart of the discussion. Is this GPU a bad value? I've said before many times that a GPU can only be evaluated by the performance it gives at a given price compared to another GPU's performance at a given price. I'm going to be doing a GPU Smackdown video on this GPU soon, which will be an extensive value comparison of this 6500 XT versus other popular budget GPUs like the RTX 3050, the GTX 1650, and the NVIDIA T600. I'll be doing that in a new video soon, so get subscribed so you don't miss it. But today, just so we can get a quick answer on the topic, I'm going to compare it to the only other GPU that can be found at basically this price, the GTX 1650. This 6500 XT cost me $215, and this GTX 1650 can be found for about $200. So they're really close to the same price, $15 different. At least that's where I live. So how do they compare? Well, in this benchmark, which is the Unreal Valley GPU benchmark, the 6500 XT, running in PCIe Gen 3 mode by the way, so in a worst case scenario, got 89 FPS on average. at a price of $250. That gives us an FPS per dollar value of 0.41. Now, the GTX 1650, running at the same PCIe Gen 3 speed, the same benchmark gives the 1650 an average FPS of 71. Considering that it costs $200, that means that the 1650 gets an FPS per dollar value of 0.35. What does that mean? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that means that the 6500 XT is a 17% better value than the GTX 1650. So you tell me, why all the hate? Why does everyone complain about the performance of this thing? I see everyone saying, oh, this or that card that released 4 years ago offers the same performance for the price. Well, I say, so what? It's not 4 years ago. If you haven't noticed, there's a bit of a weird GPU pricing situation right now. Even though GPU prices are coming down, RX 570s are going for the same price as this thing, used on eBay, and this thing has better performance than those. GTX 1650s aren't a better value. You tell me where you can spend today $250 on a GPU and get better performance. You can't, can you? So shut up. You know, it's easy to hate on stuff. It gets views. I think deep down, people love to hate on things. My theory is that we have this subconscious, primal, insatiable bloodlust that isn't being released in our civilized modern society. And deep down, we're all feeling angry and frustrated for whatever problems we're going through. And there's something cathartic about finding an object to direct your hate at. Putting out garbage products at premium prices isn't okay, and we should be angry about that. But this GPU costs $250. Yeah, it's not gonna beat out a 3050 in terms of FPS. It's not gonna let you max out the settings in Cyberpunk or play games with ray tracing with any degree of success. It's not gonna let you stream or record your gameplay if you have an older CPU. But for what it does at the price that it is, even considering the shortcomings, I really think the hate for this thing is misplaced. I mean, it launched during the height of the GPU scalpocalypse. And we were all waiting for the savior, for the coming of the GPU that was cheap and powerful and available, that would save us from this GPU drought. And this wasn't powerful, but it was cheap and available. And for the first time in a long time, over a year, which is like a decade in the tech world, there were new GPUs on the shelves that didn't have good mining performance, and scalpers knew they couldn't get much for them, and gamers could buy new GPUs again. And for the price, not bad. And they're still not bad for the price. For 1080p, medium settings on new games, or high settings on older games, this is an entry-level GPU, something you can grab for a budget build or a system that just needs a GPU for basic gaming or graphics or whatever. Man, I have a hard time seeing this thing in a negative light. I think it's good. It's good for the price. It's not amazing, but it's fine, you know? Well, there you go. There's my hot take. I don't hate it. Sorry, I know everyone loves the drama, but I think it's great on what it does for the price you pay. But what do you think? Do you think it's alright for the price? Are any of the shortcomings a deal breaker for you? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you hate me? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, click the thumbs up button if you like the video, or the thumbs down button if you didn't. Subscribe if you haven't yet for some reason. As always, I'm TechDweeb. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. Hey Trevor, you ever look up at the stars and wonder what it all means? I mean, we're so small, so insignificant. We're just tiny little specks in a vast cosmic ocean. What do we do with that knowledge? Just carry on living our petty lives? How are we supposed to make a difference in the big scheme of things? I don't know. Oh yeah, thanks Trevor for your deep thoughts on that. Well, what am I supposed to do, Kyle? We were just talking about the 6500 XT and then you got all weird with your cosmic space talk again. You know I don't care about that what does it all mean stuff. I care about things that are real, like the 6500 XT, that we're burning in this dumpster to keep warm. Well, excuse me, princess, for pondering the deeper mysteries of life and thinking my best bud would go with me into the unknown. Let's just shut up and eat our roasted squirrels.